Good afternoon. I am Chip Gibbons, the Policy Director for Defending Rights Dissent. On this day, in 1948, the United Nations General Assembly passed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 2 years later, the General Assembly passed another resolution formally recognizing today as Human Rights Day. It's a day celebrated and marked around the world, including here in the United States. However, the United States government's own record on human rights is oftentimes far from something to celebrate. To talk more about the significance of Human Rights Day, I am honored to be joined yet again by our board member, Azadeh Shahshahani. This is the third time this year she's joined us for one of these segments, and we're always happy to have her. Azadeh is also the Legal and Advocacy Director at Project South, where she has worked for a number of years in the U.S. South to protect and defend immigrants and Muslim, Mideastern, and South Asian communities. And for those of you who have watched these segments from Defending Rights and Dissent before, you know Azadeh has been extremely active in fighting human rights abuses in immigrant detention centers in Georgia, and has even represented a whistleblower who helped to expose forced sterilizations at one such detention center. Azadeh, thank you so much for taking the time to join us again.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's always great to hear from you. So can you first tell us why Human Rights Day is so important?
Well, so as you mentioned, it's the day that the UN General Assembly adopted in 1948 the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a milestone document that proclaims the inalienable rights that everybody is entitled to as a human being. So by virtue of us, being humans, we have a certain set of rights, regardless of religion, language, political, or other opinion. And it's available in more than 500 languages. And so it is pretty widely, widespread throughout the world. And it's been celebrated for many years now, and so the hope is that governments around the world, including here in the U.S., will start respecting the principles outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
So this might not be true for our audience today, but I think for a lot of audiences, they associate international human rights advocacy and the international human rights framework that documents like the UDHR are part of with sort of abuses of power that take place outside of the United States or things that happen elsewhere in the world. What is the applicability of human rights framework and the UDHR to the U.S. domestically?
Right. And so you see the U.S. State Department, for example, every year issuing all of these reports condemning the human rights record of every other state in the world except for itself, which is, obviously ridiculous. And the U.S. government over the years, but especially this administration, has tried every tactic that they can to try to evade accountability. For example, folks living in the U.S. cannot go before the InterAmerican Court of Human Rights to talk about human rights violations because the U.S. is not part of that court. Same with the International Criminal Court. The U.S. government has made sure that U.S. citizens or allies who commit human rights violations will not be held accountable before the International Criminal Court, going to such extent that when the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court declared that they will be opening an investigation into abuses by U.S. government forces and other forces during the war in Afghanistan, the Trump administration placed the prosecutor and other folks affiliated with the International Criminal Court on the list reserved for quote unquote terrorists. It's just laughable, the extent to which they have gone to ensure that the international human rights framework would not apply to the U.S. government in any meaningful way. Having said that, there are still mechanisms available to us as folks living in the U.S. as advocates, as human rights organizers and social justice organizers, to try to use this human rights framework in a way to document the violations, to bring them to the attention of the UN and the Inter-American Commission, in an attempt to try to expose the violations and shame the US government, and hopefully, in the long road, to push the US government also to try to adopt mechanisms that will lead to accountability.
I mean, I believe our hostility to the International Criminal Court is so over the top that there's a statute in this country colloquially known as the Invade the Hague Law, which basically states the U.S. would use military force to, I guess, I don't want to say the word rescue, but to get someone who was a U.S. citizen who was being tried for crimes against humanity before the ICC. And I know the issue with the prosecutor for the war crimes in Afghanistan has been something we've discussed in the context of the ongoing extradition hearing in the UK about Julian Assange, because one of those human rights investigations they were investigating came from a Guantanamo Bay prisoner who used files released by WikiLeaks that they used in their sort of complaint to the ICC, and they sanctioned the prosecutor, and now they're trying to extradite the publisher. So you're a human rights activist. You're on the front line of many social justice movements. I think I would be here all day if I was to list all of the great work you've done over the years. How has the human rights framework helped you in your advocacy?
Yeah, so earlier this year, actually, members of Congress, led by Representative Rashida Tlaib, so the squad and some other members of Congress, actually wrote a letter to the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights requesting an investigation of the Department of Homeland Security because of the documented human rights violations, including the medical abuses against women's bodies at the Irving County Detention Center. And this is truly significant. To my knowledge, this is the first time ever that members of Congress have gone to the UN to ask them to investigate a branch of the US government. And so it is truly a milestone. We have used the human rights framework for a number of years now. We have gone to the Inter-American Commission. We have gone to the various UN special rapporteurs, and these are experts in their field to try to highlight the abuses in Georgia immigrant detention centers. They have also approached them about other issues, such as the denial of the right to access higher education for undocumented students and DACA grantees in the state of Georgia. In the case of the immigration detention centers, the special rapporteurs actually did write a letter a couple years ago to the US government and the private prison corporations that run these facilities, expressing their concerns. And we have also been approached in the past couple of months by the Inter-American Commission, by the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights, and various UN bodies that have, expressed grave concern about the medical abuse against women's bodies at the Irving County Detention Center. So the world is watching, and we just recently, along with our partners at the Transnational Legal Clinic at the University of Pennsylvania Law School and other organizations, sent a submission to UN special rapporteurs, again, bringing their attention to the medical abuse at Irving, and we do hope that they will speak up. In the past, UN special rapporteurs and folks with the Inter-American Commission have visited the detention centers in the US. So we do hope that future administrations will allow that to happen again, because there's definitely the need for additional transparency, accountability, and for these abuses to be brought to the UN and to be, noted by them, and for them to issue recommendations, and hopefully, accountability will be forthcoming for the U.S. government and these private prison corporations.
So one of the bodies you've mentioned the most during this segment has been the InterAmerican Commission. For people who are watching and aren't familiar with that, could you give a brief explanation of what the InterAmerican Commission is?
Well, there is a declaration that the U.S. government has signed, as well as various states in the Americas, on the rights, the American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man. And so that basically, that document outlines various human rights that people living in the Americas are entitled to. And so relying on, the principles of that declaration, as well as the InterAmerican, as well as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we are able to go to this body that is basically, consists of human rights experts, and bring violations of human rights to the attention of this body. And so then they can issue recommendations to the U.S. government. There's also an opportunity to ask for a thematic hearing, which we have done in the past. And so, they can, that provides an opportunity for them to look into, violations in various detention centers around the country, or to look into issues related to, for example, separation of children from their migrant parents. And so we do hope that they will continue to actively monitor the human rights situation in the U.S. And, there's the issue of U.S. exceptionalism, of course, right? So you have, the U.S. State Department, again, actively putting pressure on, the InterAmerican Commission and, various governments to issue condemnations about, what may be happening in countries that are not aligned with the interest of the U.S. government and, U.S. hegemony. But then when it comes to violations, human rights violations committed by the U.S. government itself, there is no acknowledgement of it. Obviously, there is evasiveness, and there is every attempt to try to evade accountability.
So Azadeh, is there anything before we go that you're working on right now that you want our viewers at home to know about?
Right. So aside from the detention issue, which, we do hope that in the new year, there will be a congressional hearing, and we do hope to shut Ervin down as soon as possible. There is another very significant human rights issue that we are working on, and that is the right of people to access utilities, which is a pretty basic right, and so every human being, regardless of their immigration status or other status, should be entitled to access water, for example. And yet you have localities across the U.S. South that, as we speak, are denying access to utilities to undocumented folks because they require them to, provide driver's licenses or social security numbers. And that creates a very exploitative situation where basically undocumented immigrants, in order to get access to water and basic utilities, have to rely on the goodwill of a landlord, for example. And so, we have been part of a lawsuit that forced the city of LaGrange, Georgia, to change their discriminatory policy that had been on the books for about a decade. And we are actively trying to persuade other localities in the U.S. South, which are all over the South, to also put an end to these discriminatory policies.
Azadeh, thank you so much for joining us. You mentioned an investigation called for by the Squad. Defending Rights and Dissent has joined the call for that investigation. It's always an honor to talk to you, and I'm sure our viewers have found this to be as informative as I have. Today is Human Rights Day. December the 15th is also an important day. It is Bill of Rights Day, a day set aside for mobilizing for human rights and freedom per Franklin Delano Roosevelt. who proclaimed this day. And we'll be having another one of these segments on that day where I'll be joined by a number of our board of directors members for an evening panel discussion about what does the Bill of Rights mean in a tumultuous time like this one. Thank you everyone for watching, and thank you Azadeh for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.